Chapter 3. The fog of war triggers bad decisions. Income taxes in America.
By the spring of 1861, the new president, Abraham Lincoln, found himself confronted with possibly the most difficult set of circumstances the young nation had ever faced. It was a perfect storm made up of three key elements: deep financial turmoil, untimely twists of fate, and war. The U.S. had no money to pay the much-needed Union soldiers and no money to cover the costs of daily governmental operations. First of all, the economy was stumbling in the aftermath of the financial panic of 1857, a recession so bad that it had pushed the U.S. to the brink of economic collapse. The truth is, the country had been riding a financial paradigm as if it were a roller coaster since its founding. There were ongoing issues regarding the role of hard money in the money supply, whether the nation should assume the Revolutionary War debt of the states, and whether there should be a central bank at all. This fierce political struggle over whether the U.S. should have some type of a national or central bank had ended with Hamilton's Great Compromise, which for a while had created a national bank with limitations, not a central bank, the first bank of the U.S., 1791 to 1811. However, as political infighting continued, Congress did not immediately renew the bank's charter. Finally, it created the Second Bank of the U.S., 1816 to 1836, but limits were placed on this bank as well, and when its charter ran out, Congress did not renew it either. This vacuum left by the lack of a national bank created real complications as state and regional banks ended up chaotically offering notes, paper money issued by private banks, that were redeemable for silver or gold in a haphazard fashion. During this free banking era from 1837 to 1862, the nation's money supply went through giant swings. Coupled with unsteady fractional lending, this resulted in a very volatile national currency. Then, a few untimely twists of fate resulted in unexpected and massive economic impacts. The gold rush of the 1840s and early 1850s dramatically increased the money supply under the hard money standard, artificially fueling and overextending economic growth and inflating economic prosperity through the mid-1850s. However, gold mining slowed down by 1857, and in September of that year, a cargo of gold and passengers set sail from California to New York. On board were 10 tons of gold. Nearing its final berth, the SS Central America ran into a fierce hurricane off the coast of South Carolina and sank. The 10 tons of gold, representing 20% of the U.S. gold supply, then rested 8,000 feet below at the bottom of the ocean, along with 425 of her 578 passengers and crew. Simultaneously, Prime Minister Henry John Temple circumvented restrictions in London and began printing fiat currency for Britain. Between this and the loss of the Central America, the world plunged into international financial panic. Railroad stocks, overvalued as a result of the gold rush, crashed. The rest of the stock market began to tumble behind the railroads. As regional bank stocks in the U.S. collapsed, the nation found itself in a full-blown economic downturn by the end of the year. And finally, there was the U.S. Civil War. By Lincoln's inauguration on March 4, 1861, the South had seceded from the Union, and despite Lincoln's best efforts to defuse the conflict, by April 12th, the Confederacy had launched an attack on federal troops at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, officially igniting the worst land war the U.S. had ever seen. Collectively, these events handcuffed the federal government. The country was struggling with a slow economy, $40 million in debt, and a government that desperately needed to collect the revenues required to fight the Civil War. You can see how President Lincoln might have felt about the nation's finances as he settled into the Oval Office and examined the state of the books. Not good at all.
Well, the terrible thing about war, outside of death and devastation, is that it's expensive, and it's pretty much always been expensive.
Explains Danielle Bainbridge in a PBS Origins production.
The first federal income tax in the US was implemented by President Abraham Lincoln on August 5, 1861, in large part to help pay for the Civil War. But this new tax didn't impact everyone immediately. Instead, Lincoln and the Congress passed the Revenues Act, which took a 3% tax on anyone with an annual income of over $800. And this law defined income relatively broadly to include income derived from any kind of property or any professional trade, employment, or vocation carried on in the United States or elsewhere, or from any source whatever.
The dire straits that Lincoln faced were caused in part by the belief at that time that the federal government had very few options for collecting taxes. A desperate president tried to sell U.S. Treasury bonds, offering up to a whopping 12% annual interest. In 2021, Treasury bonds were issued with interest rates around 1%. However, the instability of the federal government and the Civil War made investors too nervous, and there were few takers. Soon, the mounting debt and dwindling tax revenue prompted the government to cease paying its obligations in gold or silver. Banks followed suit and stopped converting paper notes into gold or silver. Lincoln's back was against the wall. As Danielle Bainbridge outlined, Lincoln opened a special session of Congress to pass the Revenue Act of 1861, instituting the first personal income tax in our nation's history, and he did so as a Republican, bear in mind. A year later, the Revenue Act of 1862 expanded the income tax to 3% on incomes above $600 and 5% on incomes above $10,000. In the years that followed, a confusing flurry of additional legislation further extended the income tax, repealed it, and then reinstituted it again with the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. The Wilson-Gorman Act levied a 2% tax on income, corporate profits, and inheritances. Political opponents immediately asserted that Lincoln's Revenue Act was in violation of the Constitution. The public railed against this new income tax as well, with some Americans so upset they called it undemocratic, inquisitional, and wrong in principle. The confusion around the validity of federal income taxes continued for 33 more years until 1894, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling on the constitutionality of the Wilson-Gorman Act in Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Company. In part, this decision rendered the income tax unconstitutional in that it was not apportioned directly to the states. The years that followed this decision were equally problematic for Congress as it tried to find an effective means to tax the people. In the early 1900s, times were hard, people were frustrated, and the Democrats, comprised mostly of the large lower class, cried out for a tax to soak the rich. Their proposed income taxes were predicted to tax only the upper 2% of the population. The Republicans, in an effort to counter their label as the party of the rich, accepted the idea so long as a few well-placed exemptions were allowed. This bipartisan agreement unceremoniously ushered in the first tax-based special interest loophole. Amid all this uncertainty, in 1909, President Taft and Senators Brown and Aldrich proposed an amendment to the Constitution to clearly remove the required apportionment of direct taxes to the states, giving Congress unfettered authority to tax the people directly upon their incomes, from whatever source derived. This proposal became the 16th Amendment to the Constitution after securing the required ratification from 36 states in 1913. Shortly thereafter, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1913, giving the federal government the first constitutionally valid income tax. As historian Kenneth C. Davis points out,
The income tax was declared unconstitutional back in 1894, and they fought for about 15 years, another 15 years before it became part of the Constitution under constitutional amendment in 1913. The world had changed. America was now a global power. It needed a much more reliable, dependable source of income, and after a long, long fight, the income tax was made part of our Constitution.
But whether something is constitutional does not automatically make it equitable, effective, efficient, or mathematically sound. A policy born from desperation deserves to be re-examined at a later date when there are more resources, data, and perspectives to help guide decisions.